Hey everybody, welcome back to Fish Den 365. I'm Den Haring, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about how to use the concepts of structure and cover to become a better bass angler, to catch more bass.
That's what I'm talking about.
So when we want to talk about structure and cover, the first thing is to identify the difference between the two. And a lot of people misunderstand this. There is a difference. They're not the same. Cover, think of cover as any object that is in the water. This could be a fallen tree, weed beds, and rocks, any object that is in the water. Structure refers to the underwater topography. In other words, the geologic bottom of the lake or river or water system that you're fishing. So what are some examples of structure? Well, a point, a creek channel, a hump. All these would be structural elements. And then things like a rock pile, a brush pile, weeds, fallen wood, fallen trees. All these are different forms of cover. When it comes to largemouth bass, there was a very interesting experiment that was done years ago. And it's in this book. I'm sure it's in a lot of other books too. This is the Hunting and Fishing Library, and this is the book of largemouth bass. And in this book, they show this experiment where they had these large tanks, a large tank with bass in it. And in the pictures, it looks like they're baby bass, but they're not. They're very, very large tanks. And they're adult bass, several adult bass in these tanks. And in the first tank, they put nothing in there, just the bass, just several bass, and they're just kind of roaming around. They don't have anything to relate to because everything looks the same. Then they put a board over the edge on one side of the tank, and immediately the bass go to that board. All of them that are in the tank relate to that board. They go right to there. Then they try it with a bunch of rocks. They put a bunch of stones on the bottom, a little stone pile in one part of the tank, and all the bass relate to that stone pile. They go there. These are all largemouths now. And then finally, they draw a black stripe on the side of the tank, a black stripe, and the fish see that stripe as something different than their surroundings, and they go to it. The bass relate to that black stripe, even though it's not a piece of cover or anything like that. This is one of the most important things to realize when you're fishing largemouth bass. They are very, very strongly oriented to cover. A lot of different types of cover, but they have to have it. They need cover. This is what they like to relate to. This is what they use for feeding opportunities. Now, what about structure? Well, structure, those geologic bottoms, the geologic portion of the lake, the underwater topography, is what a bass uses to travel from one place or another. And so if you're on a structural element like a point, that could lead a bass from, so you have this point that goes into the lake like this. So you have, as you go out further on that point, you go deeper and deeper. Well, bass will use that point to travel up and down to shallow and the deeper water. Maybe there's an opportunity to feed in the shallower water. Maybe there's bluegills up in some weed beds that are there, and they'll go up and feed. Or maybe a school of shad comes by, and they'll use that. So they use structural elements to travel, but then if you can find cover on those structural elements, well, there's likely going to be fish there at any given point in time. They might not always be there, but they'll use that. They're more likely to use cover on a structural element than cover that's just out in the middle of nowhere where there's no structural element. So that's the first thing to remember. When you're fishing for largemouth especially, you want to find those structural elements that they're using in the season that they're likely to use them, because bass do different things in different seasons. And then you want to find the cover that is related to or on that structure and try and fish it and see what you can find. Maybe you'll find that it's rock piles. Maybe the fish are relating to rock piles on a particular day. Another day they might be in weed beds. Another day they might be on brush. But this is a good way to go about looking for and trying to catch bass, especially largemouths. Now, smallmouth bass are a little different. They don't relate to cover the way largemouths do. They often roam quite a bit more. They can relate to cover, and at times they do. But oftentimes they're roaming, but they're still using those structural elements. They're still using creek channels, a bluff wall, a point, All these structural elements are how all those fish travel, not just largemouths. Smallmouths use structural elements to travel as well. It's just that they may pull off of them. And so now you might have the question of, well, what about if I'm fishing a lake that doesn't have a whole lot of structural elements, doesn't have a ton of cover, and the ones that are out there, everybody knows about and they're fishing. So in other words, there's a couple of main lake points, everyone's fishing them. And there might be some cover on those main lake points, but everybody knows about it and is fishing it. Should I fish there? Well, that's a good question. There's two things to consider. The fish can still be using that cover on those structural elements, but because of the pressure, they may be harder to catch. So you might have to fish something different. And that can mean going smaller or very large. Something that other anglers aren't likely to be throwing can fool those fish. The other thing is you can ignore those fish and try and find fish that are easier to catch. And where are they likely to be? They're likely to be on cover, if they're largemouths especially, somewhere not too far from a structural element. So they may not be right on that structural element. They might be on the side of a point. They might be relating to a piece of cover that's a little bit away from a creek channel, but not far from it. So this is how to think about pressured waters and how to catch fish there. So how can you look for some of these places that may be out of the way or may not be found by every other fisherman? Well, using a topographic map is a great way to find these pieces of structure and cover that could be holding fish. The topographic maps show you all the structure because they're topographic. That's what the structure is based on. And then some of the maps may identify cribs that were dropped down, brush piles. They may have identified some of the cover, but then you also have to go out and do some reconnaissance as well. And go out in the lake, use your eyes if it's shallow enough and you can see. Use your electronics to take a look for pieces of cover that might be near the structure that would likely be areas that are holding or having fish travel upon. And so sometimes you can find a spot that's a little out of the way, that's not far from a structural element, and it could be dynamite. And other times it could be just a dud, and they just aren't there, and they don't seem to ever go there. I've found both. Some others, you'll have fish that use the cover, but only at certain times of the day. One thing about summer that I've learned is when you're fishing a structural element that has cover on it, if you catch them at 10 in the morning on a summer day, a lot of times in the summer you have very consistent weather and things stay the same. The water's warm now. It's the warmest it's going to be. Many times you'll catch them the same time the next day. And you can go for weeks like that where at the time of day, that's when those fish will move up. So remember that. Make sure you're charting the time of day you caught fish, especially on points. I've noticed this because the fish move up when they're ready to feed. And they'll do this oftentimes on a daily basis at the same time. And so if you're catching fish at 10 o'clock in the morning or 2 in the afternoon, be ready for that to happen again the very next day and the day after that. It's a good way to catch additional fish and plan your trip. One thing about finding some of these spots is it can be very rewarding when you find your own little honey hole that has a lot of fish and you're able to catch them there. It's a very rewarding experience. And that's what I'm encouraging you to do this year when you go fishing. Try and find those areas that are holding fish that are feeding. And then you go out and you figure out the presentation to catch them. It's all about figuring out the structure and the cover first, and then all the other variables that need to be determined to catch your fish. But it starts with structure and cover. So I hope you get something out of the video. If you did, don't forget to give me the thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And stay tuned, we'll have another video coming out shortly. In the meantime, if you want to see a really good video about a super versatile lure called the biffle bug, take a look at this one right here. Till next time, be safe out there. Hope to see you on the water. And as always, may God bless your fishing endeavors.